Hello, my students. I hope that you are safe and all your families are safe. And this is the first time that I am going to teach you online. The students of basic education, fifth year students. This is Dr. Abdulmunim Ali. I am going to be your instructor of a course, the African literature. This time, one of the most important courses in the English language department. So let me explain to you one thing, that every week I am going to send you a lecture, both in handout and in a video. And I hope that the network in Sudan can help you find the content of the course. So thank you so much, and let's go to the lecture. On this first lecture, we are going through different outlines of the lecture. 1, the expectations of the course. 2, what is a literary tradition. 3, African literary tradition. 4, different periods of the African literary tradition. And we are going to end the lecture with the last point, a pre-colonial African literature. For further information and clarification, dear students, please contact me via my email or the telephone number that has WhatsApp. So let's start from the first point. 1, the expectation of the course. The course on African literature aims at expanding your knowledge of African literary tradition. You will get variety of knowledge and information on African literary tradition, exploring the traditions from pre-colonial, colonial, and post-colonial eras. Studying the works of African writers, you will gain a deeper understanding of their text, these African writers. The course will focus on major African writers such as the Nigerian author and writer Chinua Achebe, and especially we are going to focus on his one of the most important and famous novel, Things Fall Apart. And from West Africa, Nigeria, we will be heading to far north, South Africa, Alan Paton, South African writer Alan Paton, and we will be focusing on his story, Cry the Beloved Country.
The extraordinary story of a man of peace and a man of power. Two fathers entangled in a mystery.
This is a terrible thing that's happened.
And from far South Africa, we will go to Eastern Africa, to Kenya. And one of the famous writers of Kenya there, Ngugi wa Thiong'o. The River Between will be an example of the book that we are going to analyze, and others. Encouraging you to apply critical post-colonial approaches to analyze their work, completing various assignments. So you will do some assignments while you are doing. Let's go to the content of the course. Point number 2. If someone asks you a question, what is a literary tradition? So the answer will be very clear here. A literary tradition refers to the common features and characteristics that define the literature of a specific group of people during a certain time period. These features or qualities relate to the form and meaning of the literature from that particular place or era or time or a text. From different traditions will have a distinct themes, topics, and features that set them apart from texts of other traditions. This means that literary traditions vary from one place to another and evolve over time. That means change over time. For instance, for example, ancient Greek literature in Europe, ancient Greek literature thematically and stylistically differ from medieval European literature. Similarly, African Americans in America, African Americans' literary traditions differ from Asian literary traditions. Now let's move to the point number 3. So the question now remains, what is African literature, or what is African literature tradition? Defining African literary tradition is not an easy task. It is very difficult. Why? The reason is because of the continent of Africa. The continent is very diverse and wide. Due to the diversity of the continent, defining African literature is very difficult. Scholars of African literature often disagree on when written literature first emerged in Africa. The meaning of the term African literature itself is controversial. That means debatable. Yeah, people can disagree upon it, giving rise to numerous questions. So we have 3 questions. The scholars ask questions when we come to define what is African literary tradition. The first question is, does African literature refer to literature written by Africans residing on the continent of Africa, living in continent of Africa? 2, what about literature by Africans living outside the continent? African people living in the United States or in China, in Asia, write about Africa. Is that African literature? The last question is, does it include literature written about Africa or by non-African about Africa? So these are the 3 questions the scholars try to answer the question of what is African literary tradition. The answers to these questions remains unclear. However, African literary traditions can generally be categorized, divided into 3 main periods. The first period is called pre-colonial African literature, before Africa being colonized, pre-colonial African literature, and colonial African literature, and post-colonial, after colonization of Africa. Post, that means after. So this is the categories, 3 categories of African literature. The last point is that we know that African literature is divided into 3 categories: pre-colonial African literature, colonial African literature, and post-colonial African literature. Let's start by pre-colonial African literature. Before colonization of Africa, the continent had a long history of literature. Most of the literature of this period was oral in nature. It was unwritten literature, which was passed down from generation to generation through memory and word of mouth. So the elders tell the children the stories through the word of mouth, narrate the story to the children. The literature of this period, the period of pre-colonial African literature, include folk tales, myth, legends, epics, animal stories, songs, oral poems, proverbs, riddles, and tongue twisters. The epic is a good example of popular oral forms of literature in Africa, especially during pre-colonial African literature. Some of the best non-African epics include Mwando epic, Sindiata epic, and Simba. So these are 3 examples that we can talk about it in the next lecture. So this was the first lecture. The next week we are going to have the second lecture. And thank you so much, and see you next week, and have an amazing weekend.